Hello and welcome to the regional stream about Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific is in many respects the most complex fleet region to manage. The countries are diverse with many differences in culture, supplier offering and business preferences. And then there are the fast developing megacities, which pose particular challenges. All of that makes integrating Apec into a global fleet and mobility program difficult, but not impossible. In this 1-hour session, you will learn how to approach Apec as a fleet and mobility region with the expertise of Timothy Tang, Regional PROC Manager at Bayer, Yves Helven, Global Fleet Apec Expert, Nachiket Anavekar, Global Head Facilities, Real Estate and Administration at Tata Technologies. This stream will end with a panel discussion with Yit Ming from Nestlé, Mace Hartley from AFMA, the Australasian Fleet Management Association, and Scott Thorpe of Oryx, Australia. And my co-moderator will be Yves Helven, our global fleet expert. It's my pleasure to welcome Timothy Tang, Regional PROC Manager at Bayer, for a short walk-in directly from the streets of Shanghai.
Hello everyone, my name is Timothy Tang. I'm the procurement manager at Bayer, based in Shanghai. Today I'm riding on a shared bicycle, what we call a little yellow bicycle. I think shared bicycle is one of the most important transportation in Shanghai. It provides a last mile solution to connecting people from the metro station or bus station to their home. And talking about fleet, I'm managing around 5,000 vehicles in 13 countries. Some of the challenges we are facing is to implement a company car insurance policy at the Asia countries. Sometimes it is difficult to let the leasing company to buy in our concept to unbundle the insurance and centralize the insurance at the company level. And I hope that in near future there are proper strategies can be implemented aligned with the leasing company. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timothy Tang, Regional PROC Manager from Bayer. Asia Pacific is a complex region to manage. To know how to approach this challenging market, Yves Helven, our global fleet expert, Apec, will present you the state of the market.
Welcome to the Global Fleet Conference 2021. My name is Yves Helven. As you will probably know, it's hard to capture the Apec fleet landscape in a few words. So what I will be doing in the next 10 minutes is share with you in a few bullet points per country the things that you need to know before you start any project in these countries. Bit of a disclaimer first. It is the objective for this presentation to give you an idea of each country, and that also means that there are many exceptions and specifications that we will not capture. I hope this will already set the stage for the presentation that will come today. Let's start with OEMs and leasing companies. What you need to remember now is that the Asian fleet ecosystem has not yet gone through the massive consolidation phase that we know in Europe and US. This means that we still have many local players, and that even the international players are often organized locally rather than regionally. Looking at the OEMs, I'd like to mention the 3 biggest regional players who are also very active on the global scene. There's obviously Toyota, a massive Japanese OEM that manufactures cars in many Asian countries. This means that not all Toyotas are imported from Japan. Good example is Toyota Hilux, produced in Japan, in Thailand, or the Toyota Innova, produced in Indonesia. The production side has always been extremely important in Apec simply because of the high import taxation. For instance, in Vietnam, you'll have to pay up to 70% of import tax or special sales tax. This is, however, changing for the better. The Southeast Asian countries have now their own free trade agreement, which will bring taxation down between these countries. Nonetheless, when you select vehicles for your employees, bear in mind that there's a tax component that will potentially impact your TCO dramatically. Nissan is another Japanese OEM with very good coverage across the APEC region. Brand has very good reputation, and they're also the only Asian brand that has a true global corporate fleet sales department. So it makes your life a lot easier. Finally, Kia and Hyundai. Let's get this out of the way first. If you need cars in South Korea, you will need to select Kia and Hyundai. Koreans are very proud of their home brands, and rightly so. However, if you're looking into selecting Kia or Hyundai for your fleets across APAC, you might be in for a challenge. In most countries, you will have to negotiate locally, so be prepared for this. Let's have a look at the leasing companies. So the biggest local providers are Sumitomo and Oryx, both Japanese companies. They both have pretty good coverage across the region. What you need to know about them, especially comparing with European leasing providers, is that they will not have the same type of leasing product as the ones we know in Europe. You will find contracts on duration only, so no mileage. This also means that there is no possibility to recalculate contracts or have mileage credits at the end of the contract. Finally, quick shout out to ALD, who has just started in Malaysia with a European product and who is planning to expand in Southeast Asia. Now it's time to go into the different countries. For the purpose of this presentation, I have created country groups based on the number of criteria: geography, cultural similarities, services, and service levels. Let's kick off with North Asia, and more specifically with the biggest country in the region, China. Operational leasing is very small in China, and other acquisition methods are much more popular. Most companies and many consumers will purchase cars or take a lease loan, which is a bit of a confusing name because it's closer to a balloon finance and a real lease. Now, even if lease is available in China, most of the employees will simply expense their cost or to the company or receive a mileage expense. If you want to give cars to your employees, know that it's going to be expensive, and also know that in tier 1 cities such as Beijing and Shanghai, license plates are not easily available. So even if you want to give cars and you're willing to pay, you might not be able to get a plate. South Korea is next. This is a mature country from a fleet perspective. There are some really good leasing providers such as Hyundai Capital, Lotte, and SK. They offer comprehensive contracts, often on 47 months because of tax recovery reasons. It's not common to do an OEM tender because the leasing companies will include volume discounts into their pricing. Leasing tenders are, however, possible, but you'll need a Korean speaker and you also need some patience because communication between a leasing company and a client during a tender can be quite intense. The biggest country in APEC is Japan. From a fleet perspective, leasing is extremely common, almost always on 36-month contracts because of the mandatory technical inspection or shaken, which is pretty expensive and mandatory for cars that are 3 years old. I would not recommend to do an OEM tender unless your volumes are very high. Now, the biggest obstacle in Japan is not the maturity of the market, but rather the process of making change to your supply chain. In Japan, it's not possible to change and implement a new vendor without going through a long process of building trust and relationship. It also means that your local stakeholders are not eager to go through such a tender process, and they will prefer to leave things as they are. So you'll need to come up with some pretty good arguments on why to go ahead. Hong Kong, very small fleet country and not a cheap one either. Hong Kong people usually don't have parking space for a company car, and public transport is very good as well as affordable. So best is to avoid company cars and give a budget for taxi, Uber, or public transport. Taiwan, on the contrary, is a modern, well-functioning country with very professional people. This also reflects in the corporate car ecosystem. There's a few good leasing providers, OEMs are professional, and it's not uncommon for international companies to provide a company car. Costs will be a bit higher than in Japan or Korea, but still not excessive. Let's move to South Asia. India is obviously the biggest country in the region, and the good news is that there's, amongst other, Oryx, ALD, Arval, and Leaseplan to work with, and they're pretty good at what they do. However, operational leasing is not popular, and my educated guess is that there are less than 20,000 operational lease contracts in the entire country. You do have an abundance of choice when it comes to vehicles. Many OEMs have developed products specifically for India and actually assemble or produce these vehicles in India, which is good because you avoid import tax. Now, the latest trend in India is electrification. The Indian government has launched some incentives that might be worth considering, but be aware that charging infrastructure is limited, even in the metros, which will improve gradually. Very briefly on the smaller countries in South Asia, Bangladesh people are a pleasure to work with. They're very professional and do a good job. The one thing missing in Bangladesh is the supply chain. You will have to pay for your cars or go to a bank or for a finance agreement. but there's almost no leasing provider. I would also recommend to build a good working relationship with some dealers in the biggest cities. Pakistan is an interesting country. We underestimate the number of company cars in Pakistan. It is, however, quite a challenge to provide cars. There's some local production, and the Honda Civic is an example of such a locally produced car, but many cars need to be imported from other countries, especially from Japan. Sri Lanka, you'll need to talk to rental providers or find an agreement with a dealer. It's a small island, and you will most probably don't need many cars, but they won't be cheap. Let's have a look at Southeast Asia and start with Singapore. It's very simple. You will most probably not give company cars in Singapore except to your CEO. Cars are very expensive, but public transport is amazing and mobility solutions are widely available. Thailand is becoming a big leasing country. Vendors are pretty good, although not on a Western level, and it's absolutely possible to find reasonably priced lease cars, most often Toyota Vios or Hilux or Honda Civic or City. Some lease vendors will propose products with mileage, but don't expect it from all of them. Generally, you will have few issues in Thailand. Indonesia, it's a beautiful country, but it's also a huge country. Your fleet will most probably be spread over a few of Indonesia's many islands, so there's a few things that you need to bear in mind. First, traffic in the capital region of Jakarta is horrible, and it actually doesn't make much sense to add more vehicles. So why not look at alternatives? Second, you need to know exactly where your fleet will be driving. Not all your vendors are present in all of the islands, so this will be your main selection criteria. And third, most of the leasing vendors in Indonesia are doing leasing as a side job. They are car manufacturers or they are dealer groups, but they are most often not professional leasing companies. So getting SLAs and KPIs in place can be a bit of a challenge. As for Malaysia, it's not a true leasing country, but rather an outright purchase country. This might change, however, as ALD has made its entrance into the country. Philippines, again, a big country with lots of islands. Leasing is pretty well established, although most companies in Philippines prefer to buy cars. Leasing contracts are typically in two parts, a first contract of 36 months and a second contract of 24 months. Fleet management product is also very popular in the Philippines for companies that have decided to buy cars rather than lease them. Finally, Vietnam and Cambodia, these countries are not very mature, cars are expensive, and you will need to work with your local vendors. We do expect some change in Vietnam, which is one of the most successful economies in APEC, at least in terms of GDP growth. Australia and New Zealand, let me be very short on these two countries. These are very mature markets, and you can basically expect a similar type of service than what you would expect from a European or a US provider. Just remember that Australia has an interesting product that is called novated lease. It's a sort of salary sacrifice whereby the employer deducts all or part of a lease rate from the employee's gross salary. It comes with a fair bit of administration, and leasing companies, or FMOs as they're called in Australia, can help you with that. So that's it from a country overview. What should you remember about APEC? It's solution diverse, it's supplier diverse, and it's very local. Finally, this also means that there's a lot of potential for fleet management, so it's absolutely worth investigating. From my side, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I wish you a great Global Fleet Conference today.
Thank you, Yves, for giving us the keys to unlock this promising market. In a diversified and complex market like Asia Pacific, developing and implementing your fleet strategy could be a challenge. Learn from Nachiket Anavekar, Global Head Facilities, Real Estate and Administration at Tata Technologies, how to successfully overcome obstacles across Asia Pacific.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all my viewers who have taken the time to tune in and hear me today. Before I start, I hope you and your loved ones have been taking good care of yourselves and safe out there. We are all in this together, and I'm confident that we will come out much stronger. Thank you, Stephen and his team, for bringing the fleet community together through this Global Fleet Conference 2021. This is something that was missing until last year, and I'm happy that in APAC we are progressing well to create that safety net for our fellow fleet managers. I'm Nachiket and head the Global Facilities, Real Estate and Operations for Tata Technologies. Our vision is to engineer a better world, and mission is to help the world drive, fly, build, and farm by enabling out our clients to realize a better product. This ties back in the fleet strategy as well, and this is what I'll be talking to you through today. This is the agenda. So let's get started without any further ado. The building blocks for the fleet strategy, what are they? The heart of everything, we need customer centricity, else every operations will be shaky, even if you get everything right. And it starts with health, safety, and environment. Selection for a fit for purpose, safe vehicle is the only priority for any fleet manager. We also need to consider fuel efficient or EVs or the hybrid options that are carbon neutral. Then comes the supply chain. You may have the best option, but long delivery times may need importing. Service networks may be available or may not be available in tier 2, 3 cities. Your partnership with these OEM and leasing companies is the key. Then you have technology. Leverage technology to your advantage. Dump those Excel sheets and deploy efficient fleet management software who does all the hard work for you. Then you have the lifecycle management. From onboarding to maintenance to retiring of your fleet should be seamless activity because you touch upon a lot of departments, right from finance, HR, procurement. Refreshing of fleet should be planned much ahead of time and consider external factors like COVID, change in government regulatory approvals, norms should also be factored in. Then we have innovation. Be ahead of the game. Innovate to raise the bar of your fleet. How do you optimize routes? Reduce your downtime of a fleet. It's innovation. And finally, TCO. Finally, get your numbers right. And I'm talking about TCO on my next slide in detail. So just to sum it up, these are your building blocks of your fleet strategy. But if you notice, customer centricity is the key. Now, let's move on to the next slide. TCO, control, and supplier harmonization. What's TCO? TCO is always looked upon as total lease rental into the number of months of a lease. But on the contrary, it's much more than that. And as fleet managers, I urge each one of you to drive that message back home to your CFOs and your procurement colleagues. I would say TCO is the acquisition lease cost plus fuel efficiency, operation cost, maintenance, plus leasing and vehicle administration, and the residual value. But we would fail in a TCO if we had not considered customer experience. A TCO could be the best, but what about customer experience? Have you considered that? This goes back to my building blocks where you do everything and should be done keeping the end user at the heart of it. Else your TCO will be skewed. Supplier harmonization. Is Apec ready? My simple question would be, is Apec ready for a supplier harmonization? In some countries, yes, but the larger part of Apec, no. Simply because the geography needs are so diverse, developing markets have to still import vehicles and fleet managers need to have a healthy partnership with multiple partners to keep the show running. They cannot afford to keep all their eggs in a single basket, be it leasing or OEM partners. Supplier harmonization is just not supplier consolidation or having one global supplier across the countries, because it'll fail. And I'm saying this with personal experience. It's good to have a global framework, but we need to tweak it to your countries and regions. Like I said during the Fleet Summit, APAC 2021, think global, act local will make you successful. We should be working towards a supplier harmonization in future. Absolutely, yes. And jointly create that ecosystem for everyone. Every organizations have different needs and so are the asks. But with a clear vision and right partnership and understanding the nuances, you can deliver it. Let's move on to the next slide. KPI and partner reviews. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it is one of my favorite mantra. And fleet management is no different. We don't need any fancy, colorful dashboards with numbers thrown around or a heavy PowerPoint presentation. But we need performance indicators that are right mix of leading and lagging indicators. Leading KPIs are used to predict changes or trends as well as forward-looking and help to manage the performance of your fleet. Lagging indicators are used to determine how well your process was managed. Partner reviews. How many of us have scheduled structured review meetings with your partners? Most of us are guilty of making those ad hoc calls only when a car is broken down or when you need to place a new order or terminate one. Continuous engagement not only with partners but with your end users is crucial. You need to know financially how sound is your leasing partner and how many of your users reported for scheduled maintenance that previous quarter. Set up monthly virtual open houses for your users to share with feedbacks. Share quick quarterly snapshots with your CFOs, function heads, HR, and procurement partners. Moving on next. If I could start all over again, what would I do differently? Given a choice, I would create specific policies for countries, regions, and while use the global framework. It's easier to cascade one policy, but we lose the relevance when we generalize it. Curate some specific trainings for fleet managers. Work with Stephen and his team to have the best practice sharing sessions for new fleet managers and have that safety net I spoke about earlier. I personally struggled with multiple Excel sheets and its accuracy, so I would factor a cost of a decent digital platform to manage my fleet and have it as a single source of truth. Right from sourcing to maintenance to retiring of the fleet modules, it should be there. What initiatives should be taken? And the list can be endless, but I choose my top 5 here. Defensive driving. Human, human, and human. Let's not forget who our audience is. We need constant nudging and inculcate safe driving in our culture. Defensive driving trainings before allocating the vehicles and have refresher trainings every alternate year. Or if the churn is high, maybe every year. Sustainable fleet. How can we reduce our carbon footprint? What can we do to optimize fuel efficiencies? Do we have the ecosystem to introduce EVs and hybrid cars? I'll leave you with that thought to ponder. Next is telematics. Implement smarter telematics and not a GPS data logger who throws random numbers end of the month for you to analyze. Who drove at what speed, but technology that gives you real-time visual feedback for safe driving, alerts the drivers for harsh braking, harsh cornering, harsh acceleration, and so on. Have you considered about smart routing or geofencing? Give your drivers the choice of smart routing. Let them punch the locations they want to cover, and apps generates the most efficient route. This prevents long driving hours and saves fuel. Command center. If your fleet is huge, you probably need a command center to monitor your movement live. This comes handy if your fleet is involved in critical goods movement or employee transportation. And like I said, there could be plenty, but choose your top 5 and implement what suits you. Moving on, the future. What does the future look like? I wish I had a crystal ball to answer that. But nevertheless, I am more than confident with such wonderful fleet managers. APAC will be the leader, and other regions will look upon us simply because we are diverse in everything we do. I personally would like to see greener fleet, support network for fleet managers, peer group forums, trainings, certifications, and so on. Predictive maintenance is one of the keys where we could do more. Last but not the least, single digital platform that connects the OEM, the leasing companies, fleet managers, end users, and fleet managers. Thank you one and all for this opportunity, and I wish each one of you a great success in all your careers ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Nashiket Anavekar from Tata Technologies, for sharing your expertise with us.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel discussion on fleet management across APEC. APEC is in many respects the most complex fleet region to manage. The countries are quite diverse, with many differences in business culture, in supplier offering, and also in the attitude towards vehicle fleet and mobility management. And then there are the fast developing megacities across Asia Pacific, and they have a particular challenge. Welcome to the panel discussion, Mastering Fleet and Mobility Expectations Across Asia Pacific. To understand if you can master those expectations, we have invited 4 experts. May I welcome Yit Ming, Regional Procurement Manager, Car Fleet Asia, Oceania and Africa at Nestle. Ming, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. The second expert is Mace Hartley, Executive Director of the Australia-Asian Fleet Management Association, better known as AFMA. Mace, welcome to the panel.
Yeah, good day, Stephen. Thanks for allowing me to join you.
Thank you very much for being with us. And finally, we have as an expert also Scott Thorpe. And Scott Thorpe is the General Manager, Sales and Marketing at Oryx Australia. Scott, welcome in the panel.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
And then you see, of course, a 4th expert here on the screen, and that is the co-moderator of this session, Yves Helven, who is our Global Fleet APEC expert. Good morning to you, Yves.
Hello, Stephen. Good to be with you today.
Thank you very much, guys. Gentlemen, welcome to the expert panel discussion. The first question I have for Ming. Ming, what are the fleet management obstacles in APEC, and how can you and other fleet managers overcome them?
Okay, thanks again, Stephen, for having me. Yeah, I mean, Fleet APEC essentially is quite different in terms of the obstacles. So I'll just go through really quickly. You've got different maturity levels in terms of the leasing services on offer, which people are more commonly familiar to in Europe. And it's also from market to market, it's actually quite different. The other obstacle in APEC as well, which I've noticed, is from a transparency point of view. So for example, when you do receive quotations, you would actually find it's quite common that they would just give you let's say, for example, $100 a month, and that's it. They will not have any breakdown in terms of how much certain things cost, like maintenance, insurance, and so on. So it's very close in that aspect. And there is usually some resistance in terms of looking at global templates and contracts. The other couple of other quick things as well to notice as well is from a communication point of view, it is also quite common that language barriers can be an issue, and there's a lot of interpretation or misinterpretation in terms of what is being discussed. Some other things which I've noticed in this role is that from a supplier presence as well, it's quite limited in terms of the global or regional presence. So for example, if you would like to say, I would like to have one supplier for the whole of APAC, you would pretty much come to a conclusion quite quick that that's not actually possible, not like in Europe or in the Americas. And I just guess other things very quickly is that from a single point of contact, it's also not so easy as a result of that. And you also have local market conditions which you need to worry about.
How many vehicles do you manage across APAC?
In terms of, for Nestle itself, we're just over about 5,000 vehicles. So just to give you an idea, globally, we have about 23,000 vehicles. So it's 5,000 in APAC.
Okay, good. I would like to continue with Mace. Mace, Ming was mentioning a few obstacles that he already sees as a fleet manager across APAC. The question is, of course, how to overcome those challenges, those obstacles. What would be your advice to global fleet managers that have a responsibility across APAC?
Well, I think we go back to that old saying from any sort of strategy, think globally and then act locally or regionally, and that's very much the case when you're in Asia Pacific. The fact is that we talk about those mega cities and popular densities, very different to going into Malaysia, and even Malaysia in itself has city regions and then regional regions, and there's a whole range of issues in amongst that. So I think you need to build this global view and then dial it back to see what's possible based on the area you're trying to respond to. And the biggest difference I see is the equipment safety, vehicle safety is massively different across all of APAC. And in fact, you're seeing manufacturers take out safety specifications that would be day to day in Europe or Australia or New Zealand, but throughout Asia, they take them out.
Okay, very good. Yves, I think that you have a follow-up question.
Yeah, I have a question for Scott, and Ming already touched this topic. Scott, Ming was saying, well, there's a risk of misinterpretation due to language issues, but if we take it a little bit wider, it's not just language, it's also cultural differences. There are differences, different ways of doing business, right, across APAC. Now, Oryx is a pan-Asian provider. You're present in a lot of the Asian countries, especially the countries where you have fleets, of course. What is your experience in overcoming those cultural differences, and what could you recommend to, let's say, fleet managers who are not well informed about Asia?
I think that it's an interesting question, Yves. I think one of the biggest challenges is people do come in with a mindset of what I do in the US or what I do in Europe, I will try to replicate in the Asia Pac region. So I think the first thing I'd say is, and Mace touched on it, you've really got to take a step back and seek to understand what's happening in your business in those respective countries. So it's simple questions like, what assets do I have? What manufacturers do I use? Where do I have it and why do I have it? And then from there, I think you really need to take some time to engage with your local partners, being your internal staff, to understand why things happen in a certain way in those countries. And once you've actually got some of that information, you can then sort of take some time to understand whether there's any local or regional issues that really intersect with one of your own global policies. And in doing so, it allows you to achieve some credibility with the local stakeholders, and then you can develop, it's easier to develop win themes with your local stakeholders, so you can really move your I guess, your global policy or the maturity of your global policy in that region forward. And I think that's the biggest piece of the puzzle, is taking the time to understand and both educating and learning at the same time. So, you know, not to walk into there to change everything on day one, but seek to learn and then educate why things are different in other countries as well. So that would be my biggest piece of advice.
Thank you, Scott. And Ming, maybe a quick follow-up question for you. The way Scott explains is that, you know, engagement is really important, is essential actually in working with Asian countries. Does it mean that it's very difficult to have top-down decision making? Is it difficult for you to go out to one of your Asian countries and just tell them what they need to do? Do you need to go through that engagement process each and every time?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the company's direction. Certainly, I can say for Nestle, it's more of a collaborative approach, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, most companies follow this. So it's not like, hey, you know, I'm going to come into your market and say BMW for everybody or Toyota for everybody. It's really, like you said, understanding what the market requirements are, and it's more of a collaboration. So maybe just to quickly touch on that, there is a lot of internal alignment which happens, and I think it's going to be the same, not just for Nestle, but for other companies. You have to get people who are in HR, who control the policy aligned, finance, which is obviously the costs, facility management, which is operations, and also the local procurement team over there to get your project ongoing. And the key thing to remember over here is that early involvement of all these stakeholders is very key to ensure that it's success, because you can't just sit in, I guess, in regional or in an ivory tower, as some people say, and say, you know, you need to follow this. You have to work together with the full team to make it happen.
Thank you.
Okay. I would like to continue with Mace. Mace, you are representing AFMA. It's a fleet management association. You are in contact with many vehicle fleet managers across the region. What do you think is the most common mistake that the fleet managers make when they want to include APEC into a global strategy? And secondly, what are the countries in the region where you say those are probably the easiest one to include in a global strategy?
Yeah, that's a bit interesting, that question. What's the easiest to include? Singapore is certainly much easier than Malaysia, for instance, or Vietnam. I think when we go back to your first question, and the most common mistake is having that global strategy and then not dialing it back to what you can actually do locally. And sometimes it's simple as refining your KPIs. And I think Ming touched on earlier, used the word maturity. And that's really where we are. So a range of APAC countries, labor is extremely cheap. The cars are sometimes expensive, their benefit, you know, there's a lot to change when it comes down to mobility and safety. And just the understand, safety is not that important in some countries. Life, unfortunately, is cheaper in some countries than it is in others.
Okay. Scott, what in your opinion, based on also the reactions you have within Oryx from regional and global customers, are the main challenges that they are confronted with and the most challenging countries?
Yeah, so I think it's a blend of what Mace and Ming have already said. So I think there's a lot of miscommunication that happens from parent companies moving into the region, and just getting that basic understanding of what I'm doing and why I'm doing it in those particular countries. I mean, on the maturity curve, I know you've had guest speakers in the past, Stephen, that have spoken about countries like Australia and New Zealand are as mature as any of the countries in Europe, and our products are very similar. You know, closely behind that are countries like Japan and India. But at the other end of the spectrum, you do have the emerging countries. You've got the likes of Cambodia, you've got the likes of, you know, Laos, Vietnam. And Vietnam's a country these days that, when we're talking to global companies, Vietnam's always on people's radars. And you know, there aren't a lot of, I'll say, global providers that offer representation in those markets. So you do need to understand who are my local providers that can provide the same level of service, and how do I aggregate that information to give me the transparency across the region?
Okay, thank you. Yves, let's continue with powertrains and electrification.
Yeah, and I would like to ask this question to Ming for a few specific reasons. One, sustainability being a hot topic at Nestle, and also I know that Ming specifically has been taking some initiatives in APEC. So Ming, what's your view on the speed of electrification in APEC and sustainability as a topic?
Sure. So I guess I'll cover the sustainability question first. Definitely, I think not just with APEC, but across the world, with a lot of the big companies, there's a lot of talk about sustainability. It's I guess probably you can say the flavor of the month at the moment. It's in everybody's minds. Specifically for APEC, and when you talk about this sustainability, I guess there's a couple of parts to it. So green fleet, this is one term which is used a lot. So you've got your hybrid vehicles, you've got your plug-in hybrid, you've got your electric, you've got your biofuels. Certainly it is picking up in Asia Pacific, but it's not at the same level as Europe. There are limited options available over here, and we have seen that they are quite expensive. And the other challenges is infrastructure, in terms of the charging sites. There is range anxiety as well. But definitely it is picking up here, and I can at least tell you from a Nestle side of it, it's at the forefront of every tender we run. We need to make sure that the vehicles are sustainable, clean, and we try our best to get it. And just interestingly enough, today, as I read in Malaysia specifically, you can see governments are definitely taking a more proactive approach. So in Malaysia, they just announced that you can register your interest for Volvo XC40, which is a 100% electric vehicle. So definitely it's coming to Asia Pacific, and we cannot ignore it. This is the future.
Thanks, Ming. And going to throw it over to you, Mace, because Australia is a bit of an odd case, right? Because we would expect Australia to be ahead of the curve when it comes to sustainability, electrification. But is that the reality?
The reality is we're at the wrong end of that curve. Federally, we have a lack of policy for over a decade, which continues to flag us. However, at a state level, we've seen great inroads, although we do have 3 states looking to put a road user charge tax in on EVs. The perception is that probably is likely to happen, but the reality is they'll provide some other incentive to actually help you acquire a vehicle sooner than later. The fact is we're all going to move to a road user charge based system at some point. No federal government want to embrace it. It's very interesting that at a state level, they're taking the opportunity to actually take control of a federal-based tax and I guess trial it out on a very small cohort of people, learn from the errors, learn from the mistakes, and see where it goes. So AFMA's made a number of submissions to various state governments over the last couple of weeks and months, and we'll see where we get to. It's a very interesting topic. Our renewables continues to grow. It's everyone's on board except the federal government.
Okay, thank you. Would like to continue with Scott, and we move from electrification to mobility. Scott, what about the future of the company car in the context of new mobility and smart mobility? How do you see new mobility emerge across APEC?
So I actually think there is a clear crossover between the sustainability discussion and mobility. They're intrinsically linked. So I think the first thing I would always challenge somebody is understanding what net zero means for them. And for some people, it will be that transition from ICE through to EV, maybe another alternative fuel down the path. But smart mobility is also finding its place in the fleet market. And a lot of people have linked the acceleration of smart mobility or use of company cars to COVID. I would actually argue that mobility, or the foundations of mobility, were well established pre-COVID. And now what businesses are organically doing is challenging their traditional models. And, those traditional models are going to be tested, and they will range from moving away from traditional ownership or long-term leasing models to shorter-term leasing models, so I can cater for the flex in my business as my business shifts and I guess my customer demands shift up and down. I can flex my fleet with that. But I think it's also just watching the space of whether styles of products like pay per use or transport as a service start to become more of the norm. And you only have to look to countries like Europe or even in the US, where we've had conversations with some of our global customers where their staff are pushing for transport as a service or an allowance to allow them to consume transport as they need it. And, from a staff's perspective, they're saying it makes me more productive. I don't have to drive around mega cities trying to find parking stations. If I find a parking station, I'm not paying, $80 in Sydney to park for an hour and a half. So I do think the whole concept of how vehicles are used, but also the concept of moving away from vehicles themselves to other forms of transport in mega cities and mature countries is going to be a thing that we will have to adapt to as we move forward.
Okay, gentlemen, we need to end this expert panel discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your ideas and your insights. And ladies and gentlemen, you heard it from our experts. It is possible to master fleet and mobility expectations across APEC, but you need to have a very good and defined strategy and make sure that also the solutions across APEC that sometimes are different in between countries, that you select the right ones for your strategy. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, this regional stream about Asia Pacific has come to an end. I hope you learned a lot and that you have a better understanding about how to include this challenging but also exciting fleet region into your global strategy. And it's not over yet. We have 2 additional topics regarding fleet management in APEC for you. There is a great country deep dive about China with Lin Liu from Chuki, and a regional deep dive about Southeast Asia with Reggie Cabal, CEO of Oryx Australia and New Zealand. You found all the sessions in the on-demand section of our platform. Enjoy!